Hey guys, so I want to give you an opportunity to do another extension. All of this stuff is going to just continue to improve your skills as an artist. So we're going to begin with one of these. You should be able to find one of these in your home. It does not have to be this, but this is kind of easy and accessible, and what's cool is we can manipulate it. So let's take a look at what we're going to do. Jump over to document camera, make it full screen. All right, so I'm going to take my cardboard tube here that I've got, and I'm going to just manipulate it. So in my case, I'm going to bend it and kind of scrunch it in the middle. Kind of just doing something funky to it. So you can see I really kind of, just kind of scrunched it in the center. I've kept the ends kind of as a cylinder. You don't have to do this way that I've done it. You could just fold it in half if you wanted to, but this is going to present really a nice challenge for me to draw. So the next step after you've kind of got your object, because we're going to be doing a still life now. Before, the drawing that we were doing was just kind of from our imagination. This drawing is from real life. So what's important is that you have a good source of light. It should be a single source of light. So right now, I have a good source of light because I don't have any lights in the room that I'm in. There are no lights on. So the light comes from an open window, or not an open window, but a window. Natural light will generally be your best light source. And the way that you can know if you have a good light source is by a couple of things. First of all, does it have a nice drop shadow? So this has a pretty good drop shadow. I feel good about that. Second of all, can I see lots of values across the shape that I'm looking at? In this case, I can. So I can see like a very bright, a lighter value over here, and it fades. There's kind of some in-between values here, and then it comes into very dark. And then what's interesting is it gets a little bit lighter on this side. So this right here is kind of the darkest space. If I'm looking closely, I can see that it gets a little bit lighter here. What's interesting about that is a result of this piece of paper being white, and it actually reflects light onto that part of the cylinder that I've, this funky shape that I've made. So I've got good light on this. I've got a nice drop shadow. That means that the light that is coming in from my window is a great source of light. Now, here's what I would recommend, and I'm actually going to do this right now. So I have, getting my phone, I'm going to take a picture of this, because what will happen is, if you're using natural light, especially daylight, your light will change. So let me show you the photo that I just took. So I've captured this image now, and if I come back later to work on it and all of the drop shadow is different from where it is currently, I have this nice photograph that I can study. So kind of keep that in mind. Make sure you take a nice photo before you begin drawing. Now, this is pretty much the exercise. So I'm going to begin kind of drawing this right here on my sheet of paper, so you guys can see kind of how I think about it. I'm going to use pencil. I might switch over to pen if I feel like you can't see what I'm drawing. But what's really important to understand is that you want to draw very lightly as you begin. So some of you have a heavy hand, you press really hard with your pencil. Very important as you're beginning to try to draw this from what you're seeing, that you draw very lightly so that you can adjust it. And then here's something else that's kind of interesting. So the view from my document camera is different from the view from where I'm sitting. So I'm going to draw what I see through the document camera. So I'm actually looking at the screen, and then I'm going to draw. But I'm going to leave the piece right there so you guys can see kind of what I'm looking at. All right, let's get into it. So I'm going to start by focusing on the things that I know about cylinders. I'm going to draw this curve shape. I'll probably draw this other curve shape to start, and I'm going to just try to get this basic outline of what was the cylinder before I did all that damage to it. So let's see. I'm going to draw it a little bit larger. If you draw it small, then it is difficult to get a lot of these details into it. So I would recommend when you start that you draw it at least the size of the object as it is, or if not, a little bit bigger, and that gives you plenty of space to kind of work on those details. So I've got the curve. If you notice, you can see I've made several marks there, so I've kind of drawn the curve a few times. And the reason that I do that is because I want to draw those lines until I'm happy with what I see. Another thing that I see a lot of students do when they're beginning to draw in this way is they draw in a way that's, I call it sketchy. So they do this where they make just little tiny marks with their pencil because they're concerned about making that nice long straight line. I would encourage you to try to make the nice long straight line. It won't be perfect, but you'll get close enough to what you want. You don't have to make those sketchy marks. All right, so I'm looking at it, kind of making measurements in my mind. So in my mind, I'm looking at this curve, and now I'm thinking about this distance here. And I recognize that this is not as long as this curve is. So as I'm creating that, I want to just kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to ignore all this middle part because that's kind of complicated stuff. I'm going to imagine that this line extends here and then extends the other direction. So I'm just going to kind of make that mark and then bend it. So kind of at that midpoint, I'm just going to bend it. Now already I can tell in my drawing that I've made a mistake. Not really a mistake, but it's not the way I would want it to be. This drawing, as I'm drawing it now, is going to come off the bottom of my paper. I'm not going to be able to capture all of this drop shadow on the drawing. So if this is me and I'm doing this and I want to make a finished drawing, I'm going to stop. I'm going to move the whole drawing up. So I'm going to erase all this, move the whole drawing up so that I can just kind of adjust it and get it where I want it. But because we're kind of in it, I'm going to keep going. So I'm extending that line now down. And then I'm looking at this curve over here, and I notice it very slightly curves out from the view that you guys have. So again, you see I've drawn that curve just a few times. It's very subtly round. And now I'm gonna make this mark here, so the other side of the cylinder, the bottom side. And what I notice is this mark is very slightly out of parallel with this mark. So I'm gonna kind of bend it in just a little bit. That's because of the way that I've kind of crushed the center of the cylinder. So that's good. And I feel okay about kind of this space here because this is all where it's kind of crushed. Now it's interesting because it's hard to see this from the image that I have, but I'm just going to kind of do my best. I recognize that this guy is kind of bent in here in this way. I'm just making some what I would call, I'm studying it is what I'm doing. So I see also that there's kind of a shape in here that I'm going to add and extends down to the middle of this. I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to fill in some of this detail that I see here. So about this point, and I'm looking at reference points. I'm looking at like this mark where it's folded right here is almost directly below if I'm using kind of the edges of my paper. So I'm going to extend this guy here, and that's where I'm going to start to create that where it's folded. I'm going to do just a little bit of erasing because this doesn't exist. Remember, I was just kind of imagining that that's what was going on there. And I'm just going to extend this fold up here. I'll just get rid of the rest of that. Because I've drawn nice and lightly, super easy to erase those lines that I don't need there. Alright, so I'm going to fill in some of this middle detail. I'm going to notice that this edge here kind of comes down about a third of the way into my shape. So I'm just going to kind of create that, bring it down in about a third of the way. I'm going to now kind of create this little box shape here. And again, I'm still drawing very lightly because I don't want to have to try to erase really dark marks. Notice that these kind of connect in a funky way. There's a little bit of a kind of a shape in here that I'm going to create. And what I'm noticing right now is this shape here. It's like a little bulge of cardboard in there. So I'm just going to extend that. I'm noticing now the way that this little curve comes around that. I'm just going to go ahead and try to create that. Still drawing really lightly, noticing how this curve connects with it makes that point there. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. I'm just kind of beginning to rough out some shapes here. So feel okay about what I've got. I'm going to start to now rough out my drop shadow. So I'm looking at where my drop shadow connects, and I notice it's a little bit in from what I would call the end of the cylinder there. And there's actually, because of the way the light comes in through my window, there's kind of 3 drop shadows. So there's the really nice dark one, then there's this kind of in-between one here, and then there's an even lighter drop shadow that's created, which, you know, if you go for all 3 of those, it's going to make your piece that much more interesting visually. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to create that, that mark for the drop shadow. Again, so this is a part where I'm not totally happy with what I've got, because I as an artist, I want the composition of my piece to make sense visually. And if it's being cut off by the edge of my paper, it seems like maybe I haven't considered that very carefully. So that's okay. We're just kind of doing a tutorial, so that's all okay. But when you guys do it, I want you to definitely try to think about that. So I'm extending my drop shadow here, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of create the other drop shadows as well, the in-between ones. Just very lightly drawing some lines, and even the third one, which comes almost straight down from that original shape. All right, going to come back up and just continue to study. I'm going to study this part of the cylinder. I've got a lot of shade work to do, so I'm going to recognize that the outside edge of this cylinder shape is nice and dark, and it's like it's that just very subtly bent over. I'm going to make these are like visual notes for myself. So I'm looking at where it's darkest on the cylinder, and I'm going to just make a note of that. It's about halfway across, so that should be a darkly shaded space. And then about halfway between that darkest space and the base is another mark where there's just a little bit of reflection from the paper that we talked about earlier. So I've marked that, and now I'm going to go ahead and start shading it. Keeping in mind that I can always make it darker. This is funny. So I think I've mentioned before, my preference is to turn my paper when I'm doing some shading. So I'm just going to turn it so that I can draw this line towards myself. I'm not going to shade it necessarily as dark as it will be when I do the final piece, but I'm just going to go ahead and shade in that space. I'm not going to go ahead and shade the whole thing just because I don't want to, you know, I could time lapse it perhaps, but I just want to kind of give you guys some ideas about how I would think about this. Now, we've done this practice before, so from this edge up, I need to fade it. So I'm going to fade it that way, and it's kind of the same thing down here. I'm going to fade it darker going down, but you can see I'm starting to it's important. I'm holding my pencil a little bit further back than I normally would, and that allows me to really kind of make this very light. You can see I'm already adding another layer onto my darkest space. And now I want to look again at my cylinder so that I'm thinking about it correctly as I'm kind of making my shading lighter. So I'm going to start to fade my shadow. You may notice that I'm kind of going outside the end of my line there, and I'm doing that because I know that I'll be able to go back and erase that. But I can already tell I'm going to need to make this shadow darker. It's pretty dramatically dark compared to what I'm drawing here. But just starting to think about it. But this is kind of, I'm not going to take you through the whole rest of this. I'll show you the finished drawing in another video. But this just kind of breaks down my thinking process. And this is what I'd like for you to consider for your extension. So good luck. Look forward to seeing what you guys make. Thanks for watching.